It doesn't matter how safe the cars are or how much we know about the human brain. This image right here is one of the most terrifying images that a driver can see while behind the wheel, because they all know with the right angle and the right amount of G-force, a head injury is just a short distance away from any accident. When we think of NASCAR head-related injuries, there tends to be a few names that pop into mind. Dale Earnhardt, Ernie Irvan, Adam Petty, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. are the more well-known drivers who have suffered some sort of head-related injury in the past few decades. Some got lucky and were able to leave the sport without long-lasting injuries, while others were gone the moment they made impact. It's a sad reality that drivers and fans must accept when participating in one of the fastest forms of motorsports. One wrong move or mechanical failure and history can be forever changed within an instant. But what about the drivers who somehow survive these terrible injuries? Do they live long-lasting and prosperous lives after they decide to hang up the helmet? In some cases, yes, while in other cases, no. We cannot truly understand what damage has been done to a driver unless scientists and doctors do extensive research on their brain after they are deceased. With that said, there was one driver where we didn't have to wait after their passing to know how bad their brain damage was, because it showed in his time after he left the sport. He might be regarded as one of the greater drivers in NASCAR, but his story is one that is filled with heartbreak. This is the disturbing story of Lee Roy Yarbrough, the driver who probably suffered the worst fate for a NASCAR driver. The story of Lonnie Lee Roy Yarbrough starts in the Sunshine State of Florida, in the city of Jacksonville. Despite the similarities of the last name, Lee Roy has no relations to the late Cale Yarbrough and his family. The one similarity that they did have, however, was that they were both exceptionally talented when it came to racing. Yarbrough started his racing career in his adolescent years at the local dirt track in Jacksonville Speedway Park. In the late 50s, Lee Roy started his NASCAR career in the lower tier sportsman division. It didn't take too long for Lee Roy to move up the ranks, as he moved up to the modified division after a few races and won 83 features in a 3-year span. This would open the door for the driver to start a few events in NASCAR's highest division. It would take a few years for Yarbrough to focus on the Grand National Series, but once he did, his success would soon follow. And he would make the most of it, with a tear that only a few drivers have ever been able to duplicate since. His success would start early into the 1969 season, starting with the Great American Race. In the 1969 Daytona 500, Lee Roy Yarbrough was trailing Charlie Glotzback by 11 seconds with 10 laps remaining. On the final lap, Yarbrough ducked to the low side to make the pass, but a lap car was in that lane. He was still able to take the lead from Glotzback and dashed under the checkered flag a car length in front to win the Daytona 500. Next, he won the Darlington's Rebel 400 in the final 4 laps, then won the Charlotte's World 600, lapping the entire field at least twice. He wasn't done there, as he also won the Summer 400 miler at Daytona, making him the 3rd driver in NASCAR history to sweep both Daytona races. Yarbrough won the summer race at Atlanta International Raceway despite having a 102-degree fever, and he also captured the Southern 500 by passing David Pearson on the last lap, making him the first ever Triple Crown winner in NASCAR history. By season's end, Yarbrough had won 7 races in that season and was named American Driver of the Year. Entering the 1970 season, it seemed like Yarbrough was on the doorstep of winning a championship. Nothing seemed to be slowing down the up-and-coming star in the sport. But as we are aware, the danger in the sport was at an all-time high due to the increase of speed and the limitation of safety for the drivers. It would only take a hard crash for some drivers to completely alter a career, and for Lee Roy Yarbrough, it would be 2 crashes in particular. On April 22nd, 1970, Yarbrough suffered a crash while doing tire tests for Goodyear at Texas World Speedway. Yarbrough blew a tire between turns 3 and 4 and impacted the wall at over 160 miles per hour. If that wasn't bad enough, Yarbrough's head hit the roll bar inside the cockpit with such force that it cracked his helmet. He fell unconscious and was rushed to the nearest hospital. Although it was a very scary scene, many did not believe his injuries were that severe, as he was stating that he was feeling okay, just bruised and sore. He was released from the hospital that evening, and at the time was not believed to have been seriously injured. He was picked up at the airport by Kel Yarbrough, but later had no memory of the crash, hospital, or meeting with Cale. This should have raised red flags immediately, as it was apparent that some damage happened to the driver. But Lee Roy Yarbrough continued racing at a time he shouldn't. It wouldn't be more than a year when the young driver would experience another bad accident. Thanks to the major success Lee Roy Yarbrough was having in NASCAR, he received opportunities in the world of IndyCar as well, known back then as the USAC Championship Series. Although it was only a handful of races, he would make the most of his time in the series, almost collecting a few victories throughout the years. One race he always attempted was the race that almost everyone is familiar with, the Indy 500. Lee Roy competed in 3 Indianapolis 500s in 1967, 1969, and 1970. The incident that we'll focus on is his attempt in 1971. Yarbrough was looking to add a 4th Indy 500 to his resume by attempting to make the show with a Dan Gurney Eagle. It seemed like it was business as usual on track. That was until a practice session May 9th for the 1971 Indianapolis 500. Lee Roy had spun and crashed hard in turn 1, suffering worse injuries than the testing crash the year prior. Lee Roy suffered burns from the crash and another severe head injury. Kel Yarbrough was at the track at the time and knew that this crash was way worse. At one point, he eerily said, "He was the palest living man I have ever seen." This time, there was no debating that Lee Roy suffered some major head injuries, as the driver spent the next few months, June through November, in and out of the hospital with many different ailments and memory problems. Many believe that it was this wreck right here that did the most damage to Yarbrough's head. He already suffered brain trauma from the incident at Texas World Speedway a year prior, which resulted in memory loss. This head injury, though, was much worse, which concerned many. Junior Johnson recalled how changed a person Yarbrough became after the crash, saying this: "He could remember everything from 1970 back, nothing forward. And it seemed like it just happened all at once. You go to dinner with him, and they'd put a plate of food in front of him, and he'd just sit and look at it until you said, 'Leroy, eat.' Then he'd pick up his knife and fork." At this point, it was apparent that something was terribly wrong. To add insult to injury, Lee Roy Yarbrough's performance record trailed off. A victim of factory withdrawal, Lee Roy had to scramble to locate rides in Grand National events. He won once in 1970 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, but only entered 6 races in 1971. In 1972, he accepted a ride in a Ford owned by an independent campaigner. However, he became more of a boom or bust driver, as that season, he would either finish inside the top 10 or wreck out. Yarbrough showed up for Daytona's 1973 Speed Weeks, but failed to earn a starting berth for the Daytona 500. He virtually dropped out of sight after that, never again showing up at a NASCAR event. A sad reality for many to see, as Lee Roy went from being the driver of the year to failing to make events in less than 5 years. At that point, it was perhaps best for the driver to hang up the helmet and focus on his health, but as we would soon find out, his health would rapidly deteriorate after leaving the sport. It seemed like once Lee Roy Yarbrough left the sport, he virtually vanished from the public eye. Gone from racing, gone from the house on the lake in Columbia, he took his family back to Jacksonville and disappeared. He lost his money in a business deal with his uncle, named Willie Lee, lost his 2 children in a divorce settlement in 1976, and had a drinking problem that was getting out of hand. Because of this, the court placed the children with Willie Lee and his wife, Ernestine, setting conditions that neither Lee Roy nor Gloria his then ex-wife, were allowed to visit the children within a period of 12 hours of either party consuming alcoholic beverages. This only spiraled the driver into worse conditions. In 1977, a court ruled that Lee Roy Yarbrough was incompetent to handle his own affairs, which required him to move in with his mother, Minnie Yarbrough. Sadly, Lee Roy was not taking care of the damage he received as a driver as he continued drinking alcohol. The alcohol abuse only further irritated his brain damage. By 1980, his behavior began to change rapidly, and not for the better. He began spending most of his time in bed reading racing magazines, rarely leaving his bedroom. On February 9th of that year, Yarbrough was brought to the local hospital by police due to him acting strangely by himself. Sadly, the hospital that he was taken to didn't seem to believe that there was anything wrong with him and released him at 2 a.m. As his mother recalled, "They called me and told me nothing was wrong with him, except that he apparently had a drinking problem. I told them, 'Please keep him in there. You don't know Leroy. I know my son. He needs help, and it's not the drinking.' But they released him." With no help coming for the driver, except for the care from his family, it was only a matter of time before something bad would happen. Four days later, on Wednesday, February 13th of 1980, Leroy spent most of his day in bed, with his mother bringing him food from time to time. Terry Sweat, Minnie's grandson, had left the house to buy her cigarettes. The whole day, Leroy just lied in his room, not doing anything but eating when his mother would bring him food. While doing the dishes after dinner, Leroy entered the kitchen and remarked about his mouth, saying, "Mama, look how you've cut my mouth." His mother assured that she didn't do anything to his mouth. Leroy opened his mouth to show the cut, but there was no cut. At first he left the kitchen, leaving his mother in the kitchen by herself. That was until he returned shortly and said grimly, "Mama, I'm going to do something, and I don't want to do it. I'm going to kill you." Leroy would proceed to strangle his mother. The exchange was so severe that it would lead from the kitchen into the living room. Terry Sweat returned, but Yarbrough tried to lock the door, yelling, "The little son of a bitch is not coming in here. Go on, Terry. Everything is all right." Luckily, Terry was able to break in and struck Leroy Yarbrough with a jelly jar until he released his mother, knocking him out. When police arrived, Leroy struck an officer in the face and needed several firefighters to subdue him. Police arrested Leroy with charges of first-degree attempted murder for trying to kill his 65-year-old mother, plus assault on a police officer. He was later ruled incompetent to stand trial, as doctors sent the court a 2-page report saying Leroy was insane at the time of the attack. It stated he suffered from organic brain syndrome, non-psychotic, secondary to cranial cerebral trauma from auto racing accidents. The report also noted that in cases of brain damage, alcohol can precipitate violence and other types of distressed behavior. Yarbrough was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to the Florida State Hospital at Chattahoochee on March 7, 1980. It was clear that Leroy couldn't distinguish right from wrong at this point of his life at the young age of 42. Leroy Yarbrough had no memory of the assault and was unaware of why he was imprisoned. Minnie Yarbrough wouldn't tell her son why he was there until almost a month later, which broke the young driver's heart. His memory loss was so bad that he didn't even recognize his kids as adults. As bleak as the whole situation was, Junior Johnson, his old team owner, still did not give up on helping Leroy and transferred him to a mental hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, setting up to pay for his expenses. His goal was to get him back to a stable condition so that he could offer him a job back in the sport. Unfortunately, the optimism would soon diminish as doctors who examined him were saying that Leroy only had at best a 25 to 30% chance to function again in society. In the end, staff at the facility determined Yarbrough's brain damage was too severe for treatment, and he returned to the Florida facility, inevitably ending any chance for Lee Roy to live a normal life. While in the hospital on December 6, 1984, Lonnie Lee Roy Yarbrough had a violent seizure and fell over, striking his head. He fell unconscious immediately. He was rushed to Jacksonville's University Hospital, but there wasn't much that could be done. Lonnie Yarbrough died the morning of December 7, 1984, at the age of 46. The doctor said he died from subdural hematoma, or internal bleeding, in the brain. It's one of the saddest endings for a driver in NASCAR history. Lee Roy Yarbrough had so much potential, only to have 2 severe accidents and a lack of safety strip him of his talent and his mind. He was unfortunately a victim of lack of safety in automobile racing at the time, as well as lack of knowledge regarding head injuries. Should he have quit racing sooner than he did? Absolutely. Is he to be blamed for his outcome in life? No, of course not. What about the motorsports he competed in? Should NASCAR and IndyCar be blamed? To an extent, yes. With that said, I'm not sure what these motorsports could have done to stop the impending doom for this driver, as speed was starting to become too fast for them to keep up. Regardless, Lee Roy Yarbrough's story is the best and worst example for driver safety, and not one that should be forgotten. We all hope an incident like this never happens again for a driver living out their dream in racing. Let's just hope the sports in which they run can continue to save these drivers from that 1 second of fear every driver has to face.
Most of us started when we were kids and didn't know any better. Without thinking, it's become our whole life. There's something about this game and it gets in your blood. One of these days, maybe,
I'll be in victory lane, proud as can be of my car, my crew, and myself.